a wild American Mustang, versus 100 of the world's finest Arabian horses, 3,000 miles across the deadliest desert on Earth. Most riders won't survive the first week. This is the legend of Hidalgo, a story so incredible, historians refuse to believe it happened. But what if it did? What if one cowboy and his untamed horse proved that heart beats bloodlines, that American grit can conquer Arabian superiority? Buckle up, because this tale will shatter everything you thought you knew about the impossible. Picture this: Frank Hopkins, half Lakota cowboy, gets invited to the most brutal horse race in history. The Ocean of Fire, where sand can strip flesh from bone and water is more precious than gold. His weapon? Hidalgo, a wild Mustang that civilized society called worthless. While Arabian horses were pampered in silk stalls, Hidalgo was forged in survival's crucible. The Bedouins laughed at this American fool until the race began. Sandstorms that could bury you alive, sabotage from desperate competitors, death stalking every mile, yet somehow this inferior Mustang kept moving when purebreds collapsed. The question isn't whether they could win, it's whether they could survive long enough to find out. But here's where it gets wild. There's virtually no historical evidence this race ever happened. No records, no documentation, no proof. Just one man's impossible story that refuses to die. Disney turned it into a blockbuster. Horse lovers made it gospel. Critics called it pure fiction. So what's the truth? Maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the real story isn't whether Hidalgo conquered the desert, it's how a legend about an untamed horse conquered our hearts. Because sometimes the most powerful truths aren't found in history books. They're found in the stories that remind us who we dream of becoming. Ready to discover why this fake story became more real than reality itself? Picture this: a wild stallion, muscles rippling beneath a paint coat, eyes blazing with untamed fire. This wasn't just any horse. This was Hidalgo, a Mustang, who allegedly possessed something no purebred Arabian could match: the raw, unbridled spirit of the American frontier. Born from the harsh plains where only the strongest survived, Hidalgo embodied everything wild and free about the West. Legend claims he could outrun the wind itself, his hooves thundering across endless terrain with supernatural endurance. While Arabian horses were pampered in silk-lined stalls, Hidalgo was forged in the crucible of survival, dodging predators, battling the elements, and learning that speed wasn't just about winning races, it was about staying alive. His very existence challenged the aristocratic notion that breeding and bloodlines determined greatness. This wasn't a horse broken by man's whip. This was a partnership forged in mutual respect and desperate need. Hidalgo represented the ultimate underdog story, a worthless Mustang who would allegedly prove that heart, grit, and American determination could triumph over centuries of careful breeding and inherited privilege. He was rebellion on four legs, ready to shatter every assumption about what made a champion. Enter Frank T. Hopkins, a man whose very identity defied easy categorization. Half Lakota, half white, he existed in the dangerous space between two worlds, never fully belonging to either. This wasn't some Hollywood cowboy with a clean-shaven jaw and pressed shirt. Hopkins was rough-edged, weathered by sun and hardship, carrying the weight of a fractured heritage on his shoulders. He claimed to be a dispatch rider for the U.S. Cavalry, a man who'd witnessed the brutal aftermath of Wounded Knee, haunted by the massacre of his mother's people. Hopkins spoke of riding impossible distances, of surviving when others perished, of forming an unbreakable bond with horses that others deemed inferior. His stories were so outrageous they seemed fabricated, yet delivered with such conviction that listeners found themselves believing. Hopkins wasn't seeking fame or fortune. He was a man trying to prove that the savage blood running through his veins wasn't weakness, but strength. In Hidalgo, he saw a kindred spirit, another outcast, another survivor, another being that refused to be tamed or diminished by society's expectations. Together, they would attempt something that seemed impossible, proving that American spirit could conquer Arabian superiority in the most brutal endurance test imaginable. 3,000 miles. Read that again. 3,000 miles across the Arabian desert, where temperatures could kill a man in hours, and water was more precious than gold. This wasn't some weekend trail ride. This was a death sentence disguised as a horse race. The Ocean of Fire endurance race allegedly stretched from modern-day Syria to the Arabian Peninsula, crossing terrain that had swallowed entire caravans. Hopkins claimed that in 1890, he and Hidalgo were invited to compete against 100 of the world's finest Arabian horses and their riders. The stakes? Pride, prestige, and survival. The prize? Glory and a fortune in gold. But the real cost? Most riders wouldn't survive to see the finish line. This wasn't about speed, it was about endurance, strategy, and the will to keep moving when every instinct screamed to stop. The race would test everything: navigation skills in trackless waste, the ability to find water in a land designed to kill, and the mental fortitude to push beyond human limits. Riders would face sandstorms that could strip flesh from bone, temperatures that could cook a man in his saddle, and the constant threat of raiders who viewed foreigners as easy prey. This wasn't just a race, it was a battle against nature itself, with death as the most likely outcome. The invitation came from Sheikh Riyad, a wealthy Arabian horse breeder whose pride had been wounded by Hopkins' boastful claims about American horses. For generations, Arabian horses had been the undisputed champions of desert racing. Their bloodlines traced back centuries, their breeding perfected through careful selection and desert warfare. Then, along comes this half-breed American, claiming his wild Mustang could outrun their prize stallions. The Sheikh's challenge wasn't just about horses, it was about honor, heritage, and the supremacy of Arabian culture. These weren't just animals, they were living symbols of Bedouin identity, bred for war, trained for survival, and revered as extensions of their riders' souls. To lose to an American Mustang would be the ultimate humiliation, a blow to centuries of tradition and tribal pride. But there was something else driving this challenge: curiosity. The Bedouins had heard whispers of American horses that could survive where others perished, that possessed an inexplicable endurance born from harsh frontier conditions. They wanted to test these claims, to pit their refined breeding against raw American determination. The race would answer a fundamental question: could careful breeding triumph over natural selection? Could aristocratic heritage defeat frontier toughness? The desert would be their judge, and death their final arbitrator. Here's where the story gets murky, where legend collides with cold, hard fact. Historians have searched archives, scoured newspapers, and interrogated every available record, and found virtually nothing to support Hopkins's claims. No documentation of the Ocean of Fire race, no records of American participation, no evidence that such an event ever existed. The silence is deafening and damning. Yet the legend persists, passed down through generations like an oral tradition that refuses to die. Why? Because sometimes people need stories more than they need facts. The tale of Hidalgo speaks to something deeper than historical accuracy. It speaks to the human need to believe that underdogs can triumph, that heart can overcome breeding, that the American spirit can conquer any challenge. Critics argue that Hopkins was a masterful storyteller, spinning tales that grew more elaborate with each telling. They point to inconsistencies in his accounts, the convenient lack of witnesses, and the impossibility of verifying key details. But defenders counter that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, that the desert has swallowed countless stories, and bureaucratic record-keeping wasn't exactly a priority in 1890s Arabia. The truth has become secondary to the power of the story itself. Hidalgo exists in that magical space where fact and fiction blur, where the story is more important than its veracity. According to Hopkins' account, the race was hell disguised as competition. Riders began dying within the first week, some from dehydration, others from heat stroke, still others from simple exhaustion. The desert became a graveyard of broken dreams and bleached bones, where vultures circled overhead like harbingers of doom. Hidalgo and Hopkins faced sabotage from competitors who viewed the American as an unwelcome intruder. Poisoned water, damaged equipment, and deliberate misdirection were just the beginning. The other riders formed temporary alliances specifically to eliminate the foreign threat, seeing Hopkins' success as a humiliation they couldn't tolerate. Every mile became a battle not just against the elements, but against human treachery. The sandstorms were the worst, walls of razor-sharp particles that could blind a man permanently and strip paint from metal. Hopkins described wrapping himself and Hidalgo in blankets, lying flat against the horse's neck, and simply enduring as the storm tried to bury them alive. Water became so precious that Hopkins would share his final drops with Hidalgo, understanding that their survival depended on mutual sacrifice. Through it all, the Mustang kept moving, kept pushing forward when Arabian horses began to falter. His frontier-bred endurance proved its worth in the crucible of the desert, where only the strongest survived. This wasn't just a rider and his mount. This was a partnership forged in the fires of survival, where trust became the difference between life and death. Hopkins claimed that Hidalgo could sense danger before it appeared, could find water where others saw only sand, and could judge the stamina of competing horses with uncanny accuracy. During the worst moments of the race, when death seemed certain and hope had evaporated like morning dew, it was their bond that kept them moving. Hopkins would whisper encouragement to Hidalgo, and the horse would respond with renewed energy. When Hopkins was delirious from heat and dehydration, Hidalgo would guide them toward water and shade, becoming the navigator when his rider could no longer function. The relationship transcended the typical master-servant dynamic. They were equals in the struggle, partners in survival, each dependent on the other for everything. Hopkins claimed he could feel Hidalgo's heartbeat through the saddle, could sense the horse's fatigue and determination as if it were his own. In return, Hidalgo seemed to understand that this race was about more than winning. It was about proving that their kind deserved respect. Their connection became mystical, almost supernatural, as if the extreme conditions had dissolved the barriers between human and animal consciousness. They weren't just surviving the desert, they were conquering it together, as one unified force against impossible odds. Fast forward to 2004, when Disney transformed Hopkins's questionable claims into cinematic gold. Viggo Mortensen, fresh from his success as Aragorn in Lord of the Rings, brought Hopkins to life with rugged authenticity and emotional depth. The film took significant liberties with the already dubious source material, adding romantic subplots, political intrigue, and Hollywood-style action sequences. But here's the brilliant part. The movie never claimed to be historically accurate. It presented itself as an adventure inspired by legend, allowing audiences to enjoy the story without getting bogged down in historical verification. Mortensen's portrayal captured the essence of what Hopkins represented, a man caught between worlds, fighting to prove himself in a society that saw him as an outsider. The film's success reignited interest in the original story, sending researchers scrambling to verify Hopkins's claims. What they found was disappointing from a historical standpoint, but fascinating from a cultural one. The story had evolved, grown, and adapted over more than a century, becoming less about factual accuracy and more about the power of myth to inspire and entertain. Disney's Hidalgo proved that sometimes the legend is more powerful than the truth, that audiences hunger for stories of triumph against impossible odds, regardless of their historical foundation. The film became a modern myth built on an older myth, creating its own legacy independent of historical fact. Hidalgo transcended his questionable origins to become a symbol of everything Americans wanted to believe about themselves. He represented the underdog who refused to quit, the outsider who proved his worth, the wild spirit that couldn't be tamed or defeated. In a country built on the premise that anyone could succeed through determination and hard work, Hidalgo became the perfect metaphor. The story resonated particularly strongly with horse enthusiasts and Western romantics who saw in Hidalgo a rejection of elitist breeding practices. He proved that natural selection, harsh conditions, and survival instincts could create champions that surpassed carefully bred aristocrats. His legacy influenced how Americans viewed their own horses, elevating the Mustang from worthless range pest to symbol of freedom and endurance. Wild horse advocacy groups embraced Hidalgo as proof that Mustangs deserved protection and respect. His story became ammunition in battles against government roundups and land management policies that treated wild horses as nuisances rather than national treasures. Whether real or fictional, Hidalgo had become a rallying cry for wilderness preservation and animal rights. The legend also spoke to America's complex relationship with its frontier past, romanticizing the hardships while forgetting the brutal realities. Hidalgo represented the fantasy of the Old West, where individual courage and determination could overcome any obstacle, where the pure-hearted always triumphed over the corrupt and privileged. So here's the ultimate question. Does it matter if Hidalgo's story is true? In our age of fact-checkers and instant verification, we've become obsessed with absolute truth, forgetting that legends serve a different purpose than historical records. They preserve cultural values, inspire future generations, and keep alive the dreams that define us as a people. Hidalgo's story endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human spirit, the belief that greatness can emerge from the most unlikely sources, that breeding and privilege don't guarantee success, and that the bond between human and animal can transcend normal limitations. Whether Hopkins rode 3,000 miles across the Arabian desert or simply dreamed of doing so, the story continues to inspire people to push beyond their perceived limitations. Perhaps the real truth lies not in historical documentation, but in the story's power to motivate and inspire. Hidalgo represents the American dream in its purest form, the idea that anyone, regardless of background or breeding, can achieve greatness through courage, determination, and an unwillingness to accept defeat. In a world that often seems to reward connections over character, Hidalgo reminds us that true champions are made, not born. The legend of Hidalgo will continue to evolve, adapt, and inspire because it taps into something timeless and universal. The human need to believe that miracles are possible, that underdogs can triumph, and that the wild spirit within us all can never be completely tamed. Sometimes the most important truths are found not in facts, but in the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and who we can become.